Welcome to the deep dive.
Hi there.
Today, we're diving straight into, well, a massive global story. Something the overview you sent us really lays out clearly. This escalating rivalry between the US and China,
Yeah,
it gets called a new Cold War a lot. And while it's obviously very different than the one with the Soviet Union, it's definitely a competition. It's unfolding across, well, just about every imaginable front.
that's really the crucial point from the material, isn't it?
Yeah.
This isn't your granddad's Cold War, not a traditional war footing.
Right.
So our goal today, using that detailed overview you provided, is to sort of unpack this really complex situation.
Yeah, get into the dynamics.
Exactly. Understand the core dynamics, figure out the key areas of friction, and, what it all might mean for the future world order.
It's about getting a solid perspective quickly on something that's just critical.
Absolutely. A shortcut to being well-informed.
And right at the heart of it, the big question just hanging there seems to be, who's going to dominate the 21st century? Is it the US or is it China?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
So let's maybe start at the beginning. The overview you shared, it traces China's rise. And it's pretty incredible to think where they were just, 40, 50 years ago.
It really is. The material rightly calls China a sleeping giant for a long, long time. The huge transformation really kicked off in the late 1970s.
Deng Xiaoping.
That's the one. Deng Xiaoping's reforms. That was the big shift. China starting to open its markets. And, well, that set off this extraordinary economic climb.
And a real watershed moment, it seems like, was China getting into the World Trade Organization back in 2001.
Oh, absolutely pivotal.
That must have been like hitting the turbo button, right?
You could say that. WTO membership basically plugged China right into the global economic grid, gave them access to markets, access to investment. It just massively accelerated their development.
Right.
And like your overview points out, by 2010, just 9 years later, China had already overtaken Japan, became the world's second largest economy.
That's stunning growth. Really is.
A truly remarkable trajectory. Very short time, relatively speaking.
And it wasn't just about, churning out cheap stuff for the rest of us anymore, was it? The overview mentions this Made in China 2025 plan. What was the ambition there?
Made in China 2025. That signaled a really clear strategic goal. It was all about achieving leadership, dominance even, in key high-tech industries.
Like AI, robotics, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, next-gen IT. The idea was to move way beyond being just the world's factory.
They wanted to be the innovators.
Precisely. Become a leader in innovation, high-value manufacturing. And look, this isn't just about, say, having better algorithms for shopping recommendations.
No, it's deeper.
It's about controlling the infrastructure, the data pipes, and ultimately setting the global standards for these future technologies. That gives you huge geopolitical leverage, in everything from defense to the digital economy.
Right, designing and owning the future, not just assembling it. And then there's the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
That thing is vast. Can you give us the quick version?
The elevator pitch? Okay. Think of Belt and Road, or BRI, as this massive, maybe trillion-dollar-plus infrastructure project. Global scale.
Wow.
It's designed to boost connectivity between China and, well, basically the rest of the world. A huge network of roads, railways, ports, energy pipelines.
It's building physical links.
Physical and economic links, stretching across whole continents. It's about creating these pathways for trade and influence.
So it's definitely more than just China's internal development. It's projecting power outwards, creating these dependencies and connections globally.
A big part of it, yes.
And it's not purely economic either, is it? Your overview also flags these big investments in modernizing their military.
Indeed. That's running in parallel. China's been pouring substantial resources into its military capabilities. We're talking the People's Liberation Army, the PLA.
Developing new tech, too.
Absolutely. Advanced weapon systems like hypersonic missiles, which are, incredibly hard to defend against, and a rapidly growing naval presence. Blue water Navy ambitions. It really signals a strategic shift. They're not content just being an economic giant. China's clearly aiming to be a major global power in, well, all dimensions, military included.
Okay, so you've got China rising fast economically, technologically, militarily. It makes sense the U.S. would start to take notice, feel the heat, maybe.
Definitely.
The overview you provided points to around 2018 as a kind of turning point. What changed in the U.S. view then?
Well, by 2018, you had this growing consensus building in the United States a feeling that China's rapid rise wasn't just impressive, it was becoming a significant challenge
A challenge to U.S. interests.
to U.S. global standing, yeah, and its economic interests.
Those.
The perception, rightly or wrongly, was that China had benefited hugely from the existing international system.
Without maybe playing by all the same rules.
That was the feeling, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially in areas like trade practices and intellectual property, a sense that the reciprocity wasn't there.
Which leads us straight into the U.S.-China trade war. That dominated the headlines for ages. What were the main drivers behind the U.S. starting those tariffs?
So the Trump administration kicked it off, imposing tariffs on, what did your overview say? Over $250 billion worth of Chinese goods.
A huge number.
Massive. And the reasons given were, well, several things. First, the big persistent trade deficit. The U.S. just kept buying way more from China than it sold to them.
Okay.
Then you had these long simmering complaints about intellectual property theft, accusations that Chinese firms were stealing American tech secrets,
Right, IP theft.
and also accusations of unfair subsidies. The idea that the Chinese government was propping up its state-owned companies, giving them an unfair advantage against foreign competitors.
And China didn't just sit there and take it, did they? They hit back.
Oh, absolutely. They retaliated pretty quickly with their own tariffs on American goods, soybeans, cars, that sort of thing.
And this back and forth caused ripples everywhere.
Wait time, predictably, caused major disruptions to global supply chains. You started to see U.S. companies seriously looking at moving their manufacturing out of China.
That whole decoupling idea.
Exactly. Decoupling, trying to reduce those economic and tech links.
Yeah.
It could mean shifting supply chains, like you said, but also restricting tech transfer, maybe even financial barriers, almost like building two separate economic zones.
So even though they reached that partial trade deal in 2020, it sounds like the core tensions, the fundamental disagreements, they never really went away.
That's right. The Phase 1 deal was more of a truce, maybe. It didn't resolve the really deep-seated issues. And, the Biden administration, while the tone might be different sometimes.
The stance is still pretty firm.
Largely, yes, they've maintained a pretty firm line on China, especially when it comes to those critical technology sectors.
Which brings us neatly to what seems like the absolute core battleground in this new Cold War technology. The overview you sent flat out says tech is the primary battlefield.
It really is central.
Why are things like controlling 5G or AI, why is that seen as so crucial for who comes out on top?
Because control over these cutting-edge technologies, 5G networks, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and maybe most importantly, semiconductors.
The chips.
The chips. They're seen as fundamental, foundational for future economic prosperity, sure, but also military superiority and just general global influence. These techs will power the next wave of innovation everywhere.
So whoever leads in chips and AI leads the world, basically.
That's the thinking, yeah. These tiny little semiconductors, they're the brains in almost everything modern, from your phone to the most advanced weapons. Being able to design and make the best ones gives you a massive edge across the board.
And we've seen some pretty major clashes already in this tech space, haven't we? The whole Huawei thing with 5G was huge. Can you remind us what the core problem was there?
Right, Huawei. The U.S. government raised really serious national security alarms about Huawei, which was, a global leader in telecom gear.
Especially for 5G rollouts.
Exactly. The worry was that Beijing could potentially use Huawei's equipment embedded in networks worldwide for espionage, for spying.
So the U.S. banned them.
Essentially, yes. A ban was imposed, and Washington put a lot of pressure on allies, the UK, Australia, others, to exclude Huawei from their 5G networks, too.
Which must have caused divisions.
Oh, it definitely fractured things. Forced countries into some really tough choices about their critical infrastructure.
And then there were the semiconductor sanctions. That felt like a really direct hit aimed at slowing China down technologically.
It was certainly very targeted. The U.S. sanctions aimed to cut off China's access, not just to the most advanced chips, but also the super specialized equipment you need to make those chips.
And did it work? Did it have an impact?
Oh, yeah. It definitely hit major Chinese tech companies hard. SMICME, their top chip maker, really felt the pinch. It clearly hindered their ability to push forward at the absolute cutting edge.
We also had the whole TikTok drama, maybe not quite Huawei level, but another sign of how tech and geopolitics are just totally tangled now.
Precisely. With TikTok, the concerns were more around data security. Could the Chinese government get access to user data from the app? So the U.S. ended up banning it from government devices. It just highlighted this really complex dance between data flows, popular apps, and national security fears in our hyper-connected world.
And simmering beneath all these specific company issues, there's this gigantic race for leadership in artificial intelligence. The overview suggests both sides are throwing enormous resources at AI.
Enormous is the right word. Both the US and China see AI as utterly transformative. For civilian industry, yes, but also critically for military capabilities.
Like drone swarms, autonomous weapons.
Things like that, yes. Plus intelligence analysis, cyber warfare, the list goes on. So they're both pouring massive investment into R&D. Leadership in AI is seen as absolutely essential for future competitiveness and strategic clout.
So how's China pushing back against all this U.S. pressure in the tech sphere? They're not just taking it lying down, surely.
No, definitely not passively. Their response has been pretty multi-pronged. You've got huge state subsidies being pumped into their domestic tech industry.
Trying to build homegrown alternatives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Cultivating these national champions, big companies, meant to compete globally, and crucially, a massive push to develop their own independent semiconductor manufacturing capabilities.
To break that reliance on foreign tech.
Precisely. Reduce that vulnerability that the U.S. sanctions exposed. It's a long-term play, but the ambition is clear.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly intense tech rivalry. But as the overview points out, it's not just happening in cyberspace or labs. There's a parallel military buildup and some, frankly, quite dangerous regional flashpoints.
Yes, that's running alongside the tech race.
What does the military picture look like right now, based on the info you reviewed?
Well, alongside the tech competition, we're absolutely seeing a significant military buildup. Both sides are involved, but China's actions have been particularly assertive in some areas.
Like the South China Sea.
Definitely. China's been strategically asserting dominance there, building artificial islands, putting military bases on them, really projecting power across that vital waterway.
And Taiwan.
Taiwan is consistently described by Beijing as a core national interest. They haven't renounced the use of force to achieve reunification. That obviously raises huge concerns.
And they're developing the hardware, too.
Yes. As we mentioned, advanced stuff like hypersonic weapons, expanding cyber warfare capabilities, and becoming a major player in space technology as well. It's comprehensive.
And the U.S. isn't just watching this happen. What's the American military strategy and response?
The U.S. response has focused a lot on alliances, strengthening ties with key partners in the Indo-Pacific region, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, bolstering those relationships.
Showing up in the region.
Yes, conducting what they call freedom of navigation operations, sailing warships through those contested waters in the South China Sea to challenge China's claims. FONOPs, they call them.
And new partnerships, too.
Right. Things like AUKUS, the submarine deal with Australia and the UK, and the Quad security dialogue with India, Japan, and Australia, all aimed at enhancing security cooperation in the region, clearly with China in mind.
And the overview really singles out Taiwan as maybe the most volatile spot, the biggest risk. Why is Taiwan so dangerous?
It's incredibly sensitive. For China, Taiwan is seen as this renegade province, historically part of China, that must eventually be brought back into the fold, by force if necessary. That's their stated position.
But the U.S. has ties with Taiwan.
Strong unofficial ties, yes. While the U.S. doesn't formally recognize Taiwan as independent, it provides defensive weapons and maintains that any resolution must be peaceful.
So if China did try to take Taiwan by force,
that could very, very easily trigger a direct military conflict between the U.S. and China, the two largest economies, nuclear powers. The consequences would be catastrophic. Globally, it's the nightmare scenario.
It all feels incredibly high stakes. Just, wow. But the competition isn't only military and tech, is it? There's this whole other layer, global influence, economic diplomacy.
That's
right. It's not just about staring each other down. It's also about winning friends and influencing nations around the world.
Exactly. This rivalry has a huge global dimension. Both the U.S. and China are working hard to expand their influence worldwide.
We mentioned China's Belt and Road Initiative earlier.
Yeah, BRI is a primary tool involving, over 140 countries now, building infrastructure, fostering those economic ties.
And the loan diplomacy aspect?
Right. Some critics call it that. China offers big loans, often for these infrastructure projects, sometimes on terms that developing nations struggle to repay.
Which can give China leverage.
Potentially, yes. Political leverage, or even control over strategic assets like ports if loans default. It's used quite a bit in Africa, Asia, Latin America. And China's also been pushing hard for more, say, in international bodies like the UN, the IMF, the WHO.
So what are the U.S. countermoves in this influence game? How is Washington competing?
The U.S. has been putting a lot of emphasis on revitalizing its traditional alliances, particularly in Europe and Asia, showing commitment to partners.
And domestically. Things like the Cheech IPS Act.
Yes. Initiatives like the Chia Act and the Inflation Reduction Act are partly about boosting U.S. manufacturing and competitiveness, making the U.S. economy stronger to compete globally.
And offering alternatives to Belt and Road.
Exactly. On the global stage, the U.S. and its allies have launched their own initiatives, like the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, trying to offer developing countries an alternative financing model for infrastructure.
It sounds like a lot of countries are caught in the middle here. They probably want the economic benefits from both sides,
For sure.
but understandably don't want to get dragged into choosing sides in this big superpower fight.
That's a really key point. Many nations are walking this tightrope, trying to get the economic opportunities from both Washington and Beijing while staying out of the geopolitical crossfire. It's a tough balancing act.
Now, the overview you shared, it takes a pretty sharp turn, detailing a major escalation quite recently, April 2025,
Yeah.
a full-blown tariff war erupting.
Yes, that section described a significant intensification.
This sounds like things really went from tense to, well, economically hostile. Can you walk us through what the source material reported happened?
Okay, so according to the information we have, April 2025 marked a major escalation.
Yeah.
The source describes President Trump declaring April 2nd, 2025 as Liberation Day.
Liberation Day. Okay. And what did that entail?
On that day, the report says he announced a 10% universal tariff applied to all goods being imported into the United States from anywhere.
10% on everything? Wow, that's incredibly broad.
It's a huge move, yeah. Massive implications. And on top of that universal tariffs, the announcement apparently included even higher, quote, reciprocal tariffs targeting specific countries.
And China was definitely targeted.
Oh, very specifically. The overview mentions a staggering 145% tariff imposed specifically on goods imported from China.
145%. That's practically a blockade, not just a tariff.
It's an extremely high barrier to trade, absolutely, designed to be prohibitive.
I can only imagine China's reaction. Not pleased, I assume. How did they respond?
Predictably, yeah. Beijing's response was reportedly immediate and very forceful. They retaliated straight away by slapping a 125% tariff on goods imported from the United States.
So massive tariffs going both ways.
Exactly. And Beijing also apparently criticized the exemptions the U.S. had mentioned in its plan, calling them totally inadequate.
And what was the immediate fallout from this? The overview mentioned some pretty serious economic consequences right away.
Yes, the impact on global financial markets was described as immediate and significant. The source specifically notes major disruptions. Markets hate this kind of uncertainty and hostility.
Stock markets reacted badly.
Yeah, it mentions a considerable drop in the S&P 500 index right after these announcements.
Yeah.
It clearly spooked investors about the damage this could do to global trade, economic stability, everything.
So this tariff war starting in April 2025 really seems to mark a major deepening of the divide, a serious escalation with potentially really damaging long-term consequences for everyone.
Absolutely. It signifies a pretty decisive shift towards a much more confrontational economic relationship. It carries huge risks for global trade flows and the overall stability of the international economic order we've known.
Okay, so given that escalation, looking ahead, how might this new Cold War actually play out? The overview you sent sketches out a few different potential scenarios for where this U.S.-China rivalry could go.
It does. It lays out a few possibilities. One is termed managed competition.
Managed competition, what does that look like?
In that scenario, basically, the U.S. and China keep competing fiercely across all these domains, tech, economy, influence. But crucially, they manage to avoid direct military conflict.
So, still rivals, still tense.
Still tense, yeah. Ongoing rivalry, but with guardrails. Enough communication and stability maybe to prevent things from boiling over into actual war.
That sounds, well, maybe not ideal, but certainly preferable to the alternatives. What are some other possibilities outlined?
Another scenario explored is a decoupled world.
Decoupling again.
Yeah, but on a much grander scale. This envisions the rise of two largely separate global systems, one aligned with the West, led by the U.S., the other centered around China.
Separate tech standards, separate trade blocks.
Potentially, yeah. Separate tech ecosystems, distinct trade networks, maybe even divergent political and financial systems. Much less interdependence between the two blocks. A lot more fragmentation globally.
That would certainly reshape the world order significantly. Are there other main outcomes considered?
Yes. Unfortunately, the overview also raises the deeply concerning possibility of open conflict.
Actual war.
A direct military confrontation, perhaps triggered by Taiwan, like we discussed, or maybe another flashpoint in the South China Sea or elsewhere. That's the outcome everyone desperately wants to avoid.
A terrifying thought. Any other big scenarios mentioned?
One more possibility considered is a new bipolar order. This suggests a return to a world with much more clearly defined spheres of influence, distinct alliances, somewhat echoing the old Cold War structure.
Countries feeling forced to pick a side.
Exactly. Most nations aligning clearly with either the U.S. camp or the China camp.
It's interesting, though, the overview also highlights a really crucial difference between this situation and the original Cold War with the Soviets.
Ah, yes.
That deep economic interconnectedness between the US and China today, that wasn't there with the USSR.
That's a hugely important distinction.
That must make things much more complicated, right?
Oh, immensely so. This high level of economic interdependence, it creates this weird dynamic. On one hand, maybe incentives not to let things get too bad. On the other, it means the potential damage from a serious rupture is enormous. It really complicates the calculations for both sides. It's a key factor making this rivalry unique.
So summing up, it feels like we're definitely in a phase of intensifying competition across pretty much every domain you can think of. And the ripples, the implications for the whole world are just huge, no matter which of these future paths we end up going down.
That's right.
And that central question is still just hanging there. Who is ultimately going to shape the global order? Who dominates the 21st century?
Precisely. This U.S.-China rivalry, it's so much bigger than just two countries. It's fundamentally a contest over the future direction of global politics, economics, technology, everything, really, for decades to come.
Absolutely. This isn't just their struggle, it affects everyone. It's a contest over what the future looks like, the rules of the road, the tech we use, maybe even ideas about freedom and how society should be organized.
Uh-huh.
And the choices being made right now by leaders in Beijing, in Washington, but also in capitals all around the world, they feel incredibly critical. They'll determine if this rivalry leads towards some kind of managed coexistence or, well, toward much greater conflict and division.
That's a crucial point to end on. The path forward isn't set in stone. The decisions being made now, today, tomorrow, next year, they will have profound, lasting consequences for the entire planet.
And maybe here's a final thought to chew on, building on that economic link you mentioned. Given how deeply intertwined the US and Chinese economies still are, despite all the tensions and tariffs, what kind of unforeseen factor, maybe something totally outside their direct relationship, like another pandemic or a massive climate disaster, what kind of wild card might actually end up tipping the scales in this new Cold War? How could these big global challenges we all face actually reshape this superpower dynamic in ways nobody expects? Something to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.